So, if a scripture is literally eternal, why on earth does its meaning just keep changing? It's a pretty profound question, right? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are getting straight to the very heart of the modern religious controversies that we see constantly in the news. We're going to look at how ancient, sacred texts navigate a rapidly modernizing world and how the exact same words can be interpreted in wildly different ways.
Okay, let's dive right into this fascinating material by author Jonathan A.C. Brown. His book, Misquoting Muhammad, The Challenge and Choices of Interpreting the Prophet's Legacy, explores how Islamic law and its interpretation haven't just been frozen in time. Instead, they've historically developed, shifted, and adapted over centuries.
To understand exactly how this works, we're going to cover the illusion of literalism, who speaks for God, the crisis of modernity, rethinking holy war, the modern gender debate, and finally, the paradox of tradition.
Let's start with Section 1, The Illusion of Literalism, Reading with Pure Eyes. We actually have to start by debunking a pretty big myth, the idea that anyone can just pick up a religious text and read it directly with pure, naive eyes. It's an illusion. You see, for centuries, believers have read their scripture through this incredibly complex lens of the Prophet Muhammad's legacy, oral and written traditions, and generations of really dense scholastic commentaries. You never just read the raw text. You're always reading the history of the text.
So, an absolutely crucial point here is understanding a concept called abrogation, or naskh. The Quran and the Prophet's teachings actually developed over a 23-year career. Situations on the ground changed. Because of this, early scholars used this mechanical tool called abrogation. Basically the idea that God replaced older revealed rulings with newer ones. It's a built-in acknowledgement within the classical tradition that rules can, and definitely did, evolve over time.
Moving on to Section 2, Who Speaks for God, the Supreme Court of Islamic Civilization. Meet the ulama. The word literally translates to the learned ones. For 14 centuries, these religious scholars were the ones articulating the intricate systems of Islamic law. And they functioned incredibly similarly to the U.S. Supreme Court. They were charged with interpreting historical texts and applying them to changing societal norms, balancing reason and revelation. They basically acted as the buffer between the raw text and the everyday believer. But, as you might guess, they didn't all agree. And this brings us to a deep historical divide between factions that absolutely still impacts us today. On one side, you've got Salafis, who prioritize bypassing this centuries-old scholarly tradition to just return to raw, unmediated scripture and authenticated sayings of the Prophet, known as hadiths. On the flip side, you have Sufis and traditionalists who really prioritize the living tradition, spiritual experience, and the consensus of those ulama. It's essentially a fundamental clash over whether the text itself or the tradition surrounding it is the ultimate authority.
Which brings us to Section 3, The Crisis of Modernity, Shattering the Scholarly Monopoly.
Think of an epistemological worldview kind of like a pair of glasses. It completely dictates what you consider to be true or reasonable. Well, in the 19th and 20th centuries, a massive earthquake-level disruption hit the Islamic world. Colonialism, alongside the rise of modern Western science. This radically changed the glasses people were wearing. Suddenly, these ancient interpretations of Scripture were being judged against entirely modern realities, like the Atlantic system of international law or the French Civil Code. To put that into perspective, let's watch how this builds over the centuries. Back in the 13th century, you had Mongol dynastic law existing right alongside Shariah. But the real shift hits later on. Between 1870 and 1917, the Ottoman Empire starts compiling European-modeled commercial codes. Then in 1883, Egypt hastily creates a civil code based on French law, staffing their courts with European-trained judges. Practically overnight, the ulama, that ancient Supreme Court we talked about, were stripped of their monopoly over the law.
Section 4, Rethinking Holy War, the Evolving Interpretation of Jihad.
Okay, let's apply all this history to our first modern case study, the incredibly explosive issue of holy war. Take a look at the famous sword verses from the Quran. If you were to read these with pure, naive eyes, they really seem to suggest a literal, unrestricted mandate for warfare. In fact, classical scholars actually used these exact verses to abrogate or cancel out 124 other verses in the Quran that preach proportionality and peace.
But here is where it gets absolutely fascinating. Look at how differently those exact same words are interpreted by different groups today. Classical ulama viewed it as an annual state duty for empire expansion. Fast forward to European colonialism, and Islamic modernists reinterpret these verses as applying strictly to defensive wars back in the context of early Arabia. Then you have quietist Salafis who say, yes, the classical doctrine is true, but we strictly forbid vigilantism, meaning only a state ruler can declare war. And finally, extremists and jihadists like bin Laden, who completely bypass the scholarly tradition altogether. They map the scriptural text literally and directly onto modern global politics, claiming it as an individual duty. So we've got 4 entirely different worldviews derived from the exact same text.
Section 5. The Gender Debate. Navigating Scripture and Society. Let's look at our second case study to see how the tradition grapples with rapidly changing gender roles. As historians, we often dig up these surprising ironies that directly challenge modern traditionalism. Take the fierce modern debate over whether women can lead prayer. Historical records actually show that the Prophet Muhammad commanded a woman, Waraka, to lead her mixed household congregation in prayer. Yet, as societies became much more patriarchally structured over the centuries, the tradition shifted to restrict this practice. It's clear proof that culture absolutely impacts how Scripture is applied.
But then we have to neutrally examine highly charged texts like Quran 434, which appears to prescribe domestic discipline, including striking a spouse. For a modern reader wearing the epistemological glasses of today, this verse epitomizes the crisis of Scripture. How on earth does a modern scholar reconcile this with today's values of justice?
Well, the crucial point here is seeing how the tradition historically acted as a massive buffer against literalism. The Prophet himself reportedly told his followers, "Do not strike the handmaidens of God." Classical scholars then heavily restricted the verse, using analogy to make violence effectively impermissible. By the 1600s, Ottoman courts regularly allowed women to write clauses into their marriage contracts stipulating immediate divorce and financial compensation if their husbands struck them. And today, modern reformists reinterpret the verse entirely based on the broader Shariah goal of socioeconomic justice. It really proves the incredible, enduring flexibility of human interpretation over an eternal text.
Section 6. The Paradox of Tradition. Critical Textual Analysis.
To really make sense of this massive interpretive history, let's look at author Jonathan Brown's core methodology. To understand how Islamic scholars historically weighed evidence, Brown applies critical textual analysis across 2 distinct steps. First, attestation. Is the historical text actually reliable? Did the prophet literally say it? And second, indication. What is the text's actual intent and meaning? Mining the difference between the literal words on the page and the moral goal behind them is pretty much the eternal job of the scholar.
And that brings us to the ultimate, defining conclusion from our source text today. Islamic tradition is essentially a massive, complex paradox. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, yes, a rigid tradition absolutely restricts rapid social progress. But on the other hand, tearing that tradition down entirely, bypassing those centuries of scholarly guardrails to read the raw text with pure eyes, well, that leads directly to the chaos and violent extremism we see in modern fringe groups. The tradition both governs and protects the Scripture from the dangerous literalism of untrained individuals.
So we end our explainer today with one final pretty provocative thought. When we look at this rich history, from early scholars navigating changing empires, all the way to modern Muslims navigating civil law and globalization, does the religious tradition protect the eternal Scripture, or does it imprison it? It's a question that lies at the very heart of the historian's paradox, and one that is for sure going to continue shaping the global headlines we read for generations to come. Thanks so much for learning with us today.